At 2:17 a.m., the stillness of the Black Sea was shattered. Somewhere beyond the horizon, Ukrainian operators guided a swarm of unmanned surface drones, sleek, low-slung, and packed with explosives. The target, Russia's Black Sea Fleet anchored near Sevastopol. For months, Ukraine had been testing these new maritime drones, refining their speed, range, and stealth. Unlike traditional naval weapons, these drones skimmed across the waves, hard to detect on radar and almost impossible to stop once they locked onto a target. And tonight, they were unleashed in the largest coordinated naval drone assault of the war. The Russian sailors on night watch first noticed something unusual around 2:30 a.m. Small blips flickered on their radars, at first dismissed as fishing boats or sea clutter. But within minutes, alarms rang out. The drones were moving too fast, in too precise a formation. The fleet scrambled into action. Searchlights swept across the waters as Russian gunners opened fire. Tracer rounds lit up the darkness, carving streaks of light over the waves. But the drones were small, darting like shadows between the gunfire. Some were destroyed, exploding harmlessly in the sea. Others kept advancing, zigzagging at full throttle toward their billion-dollar prey. At 2:46 a.m., the first explosion rocked the harbor. A Ukrainian drone slammed into the side of the Admiral Makarov, one of Russia's most advanced frigates. The blast tore through the hull, sending fire and smoke billowing skyward. Sailors rushed to contain the flames, but chaos erupted as more drones closed in. By 3 a.m., multiple ships were under attack. The Ivan Golubets minesweeper was hit near its stern, listing heavily as water flooded in. Another drone struck a fuel barge, creating a fireball that illuminated the harbor like daylight. Panic spread among the crews. Some vessels tried to flee, but navigating under fire in the dark only added to the confusion. Ukraine's strategy was clear: overwhelm the fleet's defenses with numbers. Just as Russia had tried to saturate Ukrainian air defenses with waves of drones and missiles, Ukraine was now applying the same principle at sea. The difference? The Black Sea Fleet was far more vulnerable than Moscow had ever admitted. Russian command scrambled helicopters and patrol boats to intercept the drones, but coordination broke down. Orders overlapped and communications jammed by Ukraine's electronic warfare units left commanders blind. For the first time in decades, Russia's proud Black Sea Fleet looked powerless, hunted in its own waters. Meanwhile, in Kyiv, Ukrainian officials monitored the operation in real time. On massive screens, drone camera feeds showed fiery impacts, burning ships, and panicked Russian sailors abandoning their posts. The room buzzed with restrained excitement. Months of planning, secrecy, and innovation were finally paying off. By dawn, the scale of the disaster was undeniable. At least 2 warships were crippled, and several more damaged. The cost: over $1.2 billion in losses in a single night. Russia's navy, once feared as a symbol of dominance in the Black Sea, had been humiliated by a fleet of unmanned boats costing a fraction of a single missile system. For Ukraine, this was more than a military strike. It was a psychological victory. Russia's claim of absolute control over the Black Sea was shattered. And with every successful attack, Ukraine showed the world that asymmetric warfare, drones versus billion-dollar ships, was rewriting the rules of modern conflict. But this was only the beginning. The Kremlin's response would be swift, and the battle for control of the sea lanes was far from over. At 6:10 a.m., as the smoke still rose from Sevastopol's harbor, the full weight of what had just happened began to sink in. Russia's Black Sea Fleet, the same fleet that had once projected power across the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and beyond, had suffered one of its worst defeats since World War II. Satellite images confirmed the damage. The Admiral Makarov, pride of the fleet, lay crippled with a massive hole in its hull. The Ivan Golubets minesweeper listed dangerously, half submerged, its crew evacuated. Oil slicks spread across the water where smaller patrol vessels had gone down. For Moscow, it was not just a tactical loss, it was an international embarrassment. Inside the Kremlin, fury erupted. Vladimir Putin was briefed within the hour, and reports suggest he slammed his desk in frustration. State media scrambled to craft a narrative, calling the drones terrorist weapons and vowing retaliation. But the images were impossible to spin. The videos released by Ukraine's military, showing fiery explosions ripping through Russian ships, quickly spread across the globe. By midday, panic spread among Russian sailors stationed in Crimea. Families of naval officers flooded social media with questions. Were their loved ones alive? Why hadn't the fleet been protected? Confidence in Moscow's ability to defend its own bases was shaken. Some reports suggested sailors refused to return to port until additional defenses were installed. Ukraine, meanwhile, celebrated cautiously. Officials released carefully curated footage, showcasing the success without revealing too much about the technology behind the drones. What mattered was the message. Russia's dominance at sea was over. Every warship, every fuel depot, every harbor was now a target. Western analysts drew comparisons to the sinking of the Moskva in 2022, but this strike was even more significant. It wasn't a single lucky hit. It was a coordinated swarm attack, signaling that Ukraine could repeat this operation again and again. The cost asymmetry was staggering. While Russia lost over $1 billion in warships, Ukraine had spent perhaps a few million. By the following day, NATO leaders praised Ukraine's ingenuity. Military experts highlighted how naval warfare was being redefined. No longer did power at sea depend solely on aircraft carriers and destroyers. Now, fleets could be crippled by fast, expendable drones piloted from hundreds of kilometers away. The attack also forced Russia to make difficult decisions. Would the Black Sea Fleet withdraw further from Crimea? Could Moscow even guarantee the safety of its remaining ships? And most importantly, how would this affect the ongoing blockade of Ukrainian grain exports? As days passed, it became clear that the strike had ripple effects far beyond the battlefield. Insurance rates for Russian oil and grain shipments skyrocketed. Turkey tightened surveillance in the Bosporus. Even China, one of Moscow's few remaining partners, quietly expressed concern about the vulnerability of Russia's shipping lanes. For ordinary Ukrainians, the news brought hope. The same fleet that had bombarded their coastal cities for months was now bleeding. Videos of burning Russian ships spread on social media, accompanied by captions like, "David versus Goliath." And David just won. But military planners in Kyiv remained realistic. They knew Russia would retaliate. Already, reconnaissance drones spotted new anti-drone barriers being installed around Sevastopol's harbor. Helicopter patrols increased. More S-400 systems were deployed along the coast. Moscow was learning, but at a heavy price. And so the cycle continued: strike, adapt, retaliate. Ukraine's drone operators prepared for their next mission, refining tactics, testing new payloads, and adjusting strategies based on the night's success. The attack on Sevastopol wasn't just a battle. It was a turning point, a moment when the world saw that billion-dollar fleets could be humbled by machines that cost a fraction of the price. It was the dawn of a new era of warfare, one where agility, creativity, and technology could outweigh sheer numbers and raw power. By the time the sun set again over the Black Sea, one truth had become undeniable. Russia's fleet was no longer untouchable. And as long as Ukraine had the will, the ingenuity, and the drones, the waters Moscow once claimed as its own would remain a battlefield of fire and steel.